Welcome to another show with Shane Silsby and I. We're doing a show today on tariffs. It's a sticky subject for a lot of people. A lot of people are still trying to figure out, like, what does this mean? What does this word mean? And what are the implications of tariffs? So Shane, give us a little update on what you've been up to, and then we'll start off. We'll let you define what a tariff is.
Thanks, Joe. I appreciate your efforts. Always good to see you here on the Public Works Podcast. I just want to say it can be a bit of a danger zone talking about tariffs, right? But it's a thing that's happening, so we just want to know more about it. We'll talk about some pros and cons, but let's just start by I think what it is. And there are two versions of tariffs. We have import tariffs and export tariffs. Export tariffs are much more rare, but for import tariffs, what are they? They are taxes levied on goods that are being brought into a country. It's goods and services, but it's mostly goods. So that's why it's so interesting is the goods affect a certain segment of the population and certain industries more than others. Who pays for these tariffs? They're really taxes, as I said in the first one, they're taxes. So taxes on imported goods. Imported means it's coming off the boat into the US, that's import. Taxes applied there to a good. Who pays? The importer or the businesses that receive those goods on the US side of any ocean or border. The businesses pay those to receive those goods off a ship or off a train. Okay. And then those businesses generally are passing those costs on to the consumers by adjusting their price up. So if you have a 30% tariff, theoretically your cost could go up by 30% for that good or raw material. Now we can talk about why that's not exactly a direct one-for-one right now and what the future could bring. The purpose, it's to generate revenue for the government. That's the primary purpose, but the second is it can protect some domestic industries from foreign competition. That's if you're a direct competitor. Some of the tariffs are being applied where we're not a direct competitor. We can talk about coffee and things like that. The example is the U.S. imposing tariffs on imported steel. And the thought is, well, might that help U.S. domestic steel producers? But I think today my proposal is we talk a little bit about steel and aluminum, because those are the things that are affecting or likely to affect the public works industry the most. And the last thing I would say about this is that the current administration, the U.S. presidential administration, has imposed two types of tariffs. One is called a universal tariff or a baseline tariff. That's 10% on everybody. And then there's something called a reciprocal tariff or targeted tariffs, and those vary from 11% to 50%. Or, in the news, you might hear 145%, whatever it is. Those are the things that vary by country and can also vary, which not to get too complex, but can also vary by type of product or good. Mm. So you can get variation by country and they can get variation by type of thing coming from that country. So that's the import tariffs.
Okay, real quick before we get into export tariffs, which I don't think we have to worry about that much. But article just hit the news about 4 hours ago. It says heavy equipment maker Caterpillar is now warning investors that tariffs will take a bigger bite out of business. It now expects a hit of 1.8 billion this year from levies, up from an expected 1.3 billion and 1.5 billion impact just a few weeks ago. One analyst noted that Caterpillar is directly affected by Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum. Caterpillar, for his part, argues it's still taking measures to minimize the pain, saying that trade and tariff negotiations to continue to be fluid. And so, in regards to the negotiations, and like you even said about there's certain things that are being, let's just call it a tax, a tariff, on its way over to the States. Some countries can produce a car and the government will say, hey, we don't want that tariffed. That same country could produce, let's say, a mattress, but that mattress will be tariffed. So where's probably the best place to go for let's say a fleet supervisor, a public works leader, director, where would they go to figure out like what kind of products, services would be tariffed in the next coming months to years, and depending on where they get their products or services from?
That is a very difficult question. That's why
Sorry.
I'm not an economist, Joe. This is a Friday afternoon, like I'm
Come
trying
on, man.
to get it out. So because it depends on the type of thing you're trying to buy and the material that's included in that thing and the place where those materials were sourced and the country which that source is in and the date that you actually buy that thing, all those variables affect the rate you're going to pay for that thing. But, and I have some information, we can dive into a little bit on that, but back to the Caterpillar issue. We didn't plan this, but I said, I think we probably should talk about steel and aluminum. You brought up Caterpillar, which their equipment's made out of what?
Steel and aluminum. Yeah.
Steel and aluminum,
Yeah,
right? So,
yeah.
so it's not unusual that they'd be saying, this is going to be an impact to our business directly.
Yeah.
So real quick on export tariffs, it's very rare and it's only to, usually to protect things that are important to your country, right? Joseph Blackman's gold stockpile, if he wants to protect it, he's going to put an export tariff on it to keep it kind of in the country.
Yeah.
If the U.S. gets in that situation, that would be very good because that means we have something that other people want, or we're creating a product that's so desirable that people are willing to pay us, right, to receive it as an export tariff. Okay, so that is on tariff. So real quick, I'm going to see if I can give these updates on aluminum and steel.
Sure.
So we just talked about the impacts of aluminum and steel on the public works industry. Show my screen. Okay, still good?
Yep.
All right, so here's what's happening with steel and aluminum tariffs throughout 2025. And remember, all of this is happening since the new administration took over in DC. I'm not saying right or wrong. I'm just saying this is what's happening, right? So March, right, 25% on steel and aluminum. All countries, no exemptions. June 4th, now up to 50. 23rd, it expands to other elements, not just raw materials of steel and aluminum. Back to my answer to you on it depends on components. And then they covered additional categories in the latest thing, and that's why we're talking about it now, right? August 19th, there were just all these tariffs went into place, except for a few which got delayed. So this is what's happening just in 2025 to steel and aluminum. So steel pricing. This goes up and down, right? But if you look at this, I have an example to use off this. At this point right here is about 41, but in my example, like if I go across, right, about 41. In my example, I used 40. We're going to talk about that in a minute. The bottom line is this is in the past year. Okay, this is looking over a year of steel prices. So we can see that in the beginning of the year, we were down to about 34. This is dollars for, it's called a 100-weight. The C is like a centennial, like a 100-weight. It's how we measure steel as a mass or density. That's a whole nother podcast, Joe, on 100-weight. So the point is that's like the rate you pay for steel.
Yeah.
So we were down here. Now we're up here. At one point in March, we were all the way up here. So steel has gone up in pricing in general. And that's not just because of tariffs, but because of what happened, supply and demand. Tariffs have an impact on that, infrastructure bills, all that stuff. So that's steel. Now let's see if I can go to the next one. This is aluminum. So here's aluminum. This is more up and down. And then this has been a steady increase since May on aluminum. So steel and aluminum, here's the price a year ago. Here's the price at the beginning of the year. We had some tariff discussion. Now we're about here.
Yeah.
Bottom line is a year ago it was here and now it's here. Okay. That's independent of tariffs. That's the price of this thing. Okay.
Yeah.
Now it is impacted indirectly by tariffs and economy and all those things, but
wouldn't you say so? To kind of clarify for myself and maybe some of the listeners, aluminum price, steel price, price of oil, price of, I don't know, let's say corn, like these are goods that Americans put that it's kind of like a stock. It's perceived value, meaning it's set by the demand and supply of the market. When there's a, let's say, an explosion in the Middle East, it's an oil or something, or there's a war, the price of oil is going to go up. It doesn't matter if that explosion or that war has already started or anything has any happened. It's just more so I would say a bet, because again, stocks are what, they're more so an agreed upon bet that we're going to place a valuation on a certain product. These, like you said, they're unrelated to tariffs, which is okay. But when the tariffs do, I guess, take hold, and again, in my journeys and my talks, I haven't really met too many people that have been like, oh man, these tariffs are driving the price of X, Y, and Z up. It's like, from my experience from selling trucks and having to deal with steel, because frame rails and debris bodies and stuff like that, it was more so the amount of time it took for things and PTOs to come from China and stuff like that we couldn't get on time. And then of course demand goes up, which inherently makes the price of things go up. So when we do see the tariffs, what will kind of that canary in the coal mine be for a public works director that he'll get from his fleet guy to say, hey, this isn't the average price going up just because of supply and demand. This is the tariff starting to hit our, the shoreline of the states. Like, what does that look like? And can you kind of talk us through that, how that picture plays out?
I will do my best. There are two things you brought up, which I want to highlight. One is you brought up the stock market. Tariffs and what they do to global trade is increasing the costs for everybody around the world, because we're, reciprocal tariffs, right? People say, oh, I'm going to tariff you back. And
Yeah.
I have an example to show this. So the costs are going up. So what's the pro? Those are cons. What's the pro?
Yeah.
Well, the US government and all the governments are getting money from tariffs. So if you think that's a good thing, that's a pro for you. And, our session we did on the One Big Beautiful Bill Act talks about the deficit that was created by that act, $3.3 trillion for the US. So you have to get money somewhere. So maybe this is the way to do it. The biggest misconception on who's paying for the tariffs, it's the businesses in the US and the consumers in the US. That's who pays for them. So 2 points real quick. One is the stock market. That people think that's a pro. It's gambling. So right now people are up.
Yeah.
But who doesn't play the stock market? Who cannot play the stock market with their dollars?
Municipalities.
Yeah. And community, we didn't pre-tape that. That is Joe picking up on what I'm laying down. Municipalities cannot play the stock. It's illegal for them to invest and do those things in the stock market. So
even floating bonds and stuff like that, that's still a play.
Yeah, when they issue bonds, that's off a revenue payment back from a source that all has to be very structured, and the bond rate is set for the life of the term. So it's not that they don't do financing, it's that they don't play the stock market and the ups and downs that these tariffs are generating for winners in the stock market right now.
Yep.
That's why it's a problem for public works agencies. They cannot reap any rewards. Whether they would or not is a different issue. They can't play the stock market. So that's the first thing. The second thing is your comment about delayed impacts from tariffs. There's a lot that goes into this, and I've been talking to people, businesses, small, large. For now, a lot of the businesses are reducing their profit to try to hold the price steady as long as they can.
Yep.
Okay. So if you have a 10% tariff and your business is generating 20% profit and you reduce your profit by 10%, the cost to the consumer looks the same.
Yeah. But you have 10% less in your bank account.
The business is being hurt by that, and that affects the business's ability to pay for jobs, to invest, to have a long-term financial benefit. So that's part of it. The other thing with raw materials is stockpiling. So some folks did purchases or advanced selection of raw materials ahead of some of the tariffs, and they're just stockpiling those. And with the raw materials, I think what we're seeing is if the U.S. companies, any of those companies are advantaged by the tariffs, the increase in price from external sources, they're just slowly increasing their local domestic prices.
Mhm.
So because they can now, right, that competition. So maybe there's a theory that people think, well, if we produce in the U.S., it'll be less money. But that's not the actual reality, right? It just means the dollars are somewhere else. At the end of the day, the cost increases are all being paid by the local community. So I just wanted to explain, that's a good point you brought up, was like, why don't I see, right? China has a 30%, why don't I see 30% increase? And I'll talk to you about a little bit of the ways that is being manipulated in the market, but that's the main thing right now.
Wins and losses. I want to kind of park on that for a little bit longer. Wouldn't you say, I mean, like everybody listening in, wouldn't you say that if you gave a head nod that the government is trying to win in regards to tariffs? The problem is what a win looks like and to who wins, and like you said, who pays for it. In my finite wisdom, I would think that these tariffs are a play for the U.S. to come out winning. And I would think, again, in my finite wisdom, that a win would be, okay, let's stop buying steel at such a rate from China. Let's produce steel like we used to in the States. What does that do? What does the win mean for that? That means, okay, the average house price in America in certain, I would say, in the suburbs of some of the big metropolitan areas are $500,000, $600,000, $400,000 to $600,000. Not too many people can afford that. But if these steel companies could produce steel back in the States, let's say we could have more people gainfully employed. That will allow more people on our home turf to be able to win more instead of sending that money overseas. That's what I think the play is. I'm probably wrong, but when I think of charging somebody more to produce in your backyard, you're saying, hey, us in our backyard need to produce more and us can make more and keep the money in-house. Am I correct in thinking that? Am I wrong in thinking that? What are your thoughts?
Well, there's two things you mentioned there. One is, government being a winner from tariffs, and that can be the case. The challenge is when those dollars are collected through the import taxes, it's going into a general fund, which then can be used for whatever the administration wants, more military, more immigration, whatever it is.
More tanks.
More tanks, right? Trading tanks for infrastructure on our last podcast. Go check it out, the publicworkspodcast.com. Unlike doing an adjustment to the federal gas tax, we're talking about infrastructure, where that money, you raise the tax rate, call it a tariff if you want. Everybody loves tariffs, so call it a gas tariff.
Yeah.
You raise that rate, but those dollars that come in are restricted to be used for transportation.
Yeah.
Right. That's the difference here is, the government's bringing in a lot of money, but it's not restricted. It's just floating and So that's the first thing. So that's why the government would be a winner, but we as people that depend on the government, we might see it a little bit differently. The second thing you mentioned is on the business side. Isn't it better for businesses, steel? We're talking about steel and aluminum today.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. does produce some steel. That is theoretical, right? So, and that theory needs to have a few assumptions. It has to assume that we have factories in the U.S. to manufacture the raw materials that produce steel beams that we use for construction.
Yep.
That theory also has to assume that you have enough and you can access enough of those raw materials in the continental United States or whatever, Alaska, but in the United States without an offshore source to meet the demands of those factories, which don't exist today, to manufacture the steel, which we need in the U.S. to build construction. And the third assumption is that if you had the first two things, you had enough materials and you had factories to do it, you also need a workforce to run those factories.
Yeah.
And that is, that gets a little bit subjective because for Americans today, I don't believe every job is considered a great job. So, right. So your workforce has to want to work in a steel mill
Yeah.
as their career goal. Right. And then the third
Yes.
assumption, the fourth assumption real quick is that the steel we can produce from those first three things, if you had all those, is enough to meet the demand for construction in the United States, which if we don't have that, it slows down the economy, slows down infrastructure. So that's where the theory breaks down. Right.
Well,
So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. If there were like, let's rewind back to the 70s, even the 80s. You know, the average steel worker could provide for a family of three, you know, meaning the home price wasn't too crazy. The price of a vehicle wasn't too crazy, where only the man worked, the wife could stay at home with the children. And that was kind of how it was. It's not like that today. I mean, I'm 38 years old. Like, I got a college degree. It's not like that. Dual income households are a thing, and they have to be a thing in order to, you know, do what you want to do in society today. When I say that, bringing jobs back to America, yes, not every job is coveted. Not every, like, hotels, you know, people who are cleaning those aren't the average American. The people picking strawberries, that's not the average, would you say, legacy American. Those jobs are jobs that a certain demographic take on, and I understand that. My brain goes to things like Uber, to things like TaskRabbit, to things like DoorDash. You know, the last time you hopped in an Uber, it was probably a person who was somewhat competent at life, meaning they either had a career or they did something. You know, they keep their car clean, they keep their car maintained, they can present well, they speak decently. So why aren't they an actual career? Why are they, you know, 30 to 50 years old and driving Uber as a career, as, you know, as their primary source of income? And I think that it's because those types of people would be in those still jobs, those, you know, the still work type jobs. They want to provide for their family, and those places of employment are able to pay them a living wage to where that living wage could take care of a family. So yes, you're right. And like, it's caveated with, we have to have the infrastructure to be able to supply those jobs. But I do think that if there was an incentive for these companies, again, incentive means the amount of profit they could take home versus, you know, the buyers buying it from China when you know, and so the incentive is to build more in America. And that's where my brain goes of thinking like, oh, okay, like, let's say they could make more and the Rust Belt got rejuvenated to where they could start producing steel again, and all those communities weren't looking like how they do now, and now they could, you know, actually produce and be gainful and have gainful employment. I do think we could get there, but I don't, again, there would have to be a mindset shift of like, we need to produce more. And then also, like, those jobs would need to be filled by people who are somewhat competent and would like to do those jobs and are proud about having those jobs.
All good points. So the technical assumptions we talked about for a potential theoretical pro for tariffs. So we went through the technical assumptions. You're trying to say, Shane, tell me the pros of tariffing, because theoretically you could protect domestic supply, production, sale. So we talked about the technical inputs. The other thing we have in the realities is China is the biggest producer of steel in the world. So they have the most resources. They have a workforce that, I don't know all the statistics, but they're not going to be paid the same likely than a middle income American worker. Again, go do your own research on that. I'm making a presumption there. So they have and because they produce so much, their refinement is pretty efficient, right? So they're able to produce it, you know, collect it, produce it, ship it, all for less than we can do here in the US, right? So the other assumption we have to bring in, which is not a technical one, but a social one, is that people are willing to pay more for US discovered, developed, refined, sold products, likely much more than they would from another source.
I don't think so.
So there you go.
I think a lot of people fly that flag up. I'm going to buy America, but if you can feed your family Chipotle versus, you know, beans and rice, you're going to You're gonna keep that profit in house.
Yeah, we're seeing anyway, there's other shifts we can see in the economy that say people are cost conscious and they are changing their decision points. So in a global economy, Americans, which is the largest consumer economy in the world, have shown that they're going to buy the most affordable, and maybe it's a balance of quality and quantity, but they're going to try to get the best deal, right? We're going to get the best deal. That's the challenge and where things start to break down. The other place where it breaks down is in the prior administration. I'm not saying good or bad, but there was something called the Chips and Science Act, where we actually did build manufacturing facilities, one in your backyard in Arizona, to build semiconductor chips in the US. And that was part local through City of Phoenix and part through federal programs. And that generated some facilities across the United States. That was the federal government making an investment or reform adjustment to trigger the development or construction of those manufacturing facilities. If you say that the government of today wants to do that same thing, then the money that we're making from the steel and aluminum tariffs we just went through should go directly back to investing in discovery of raw materials, development of manufacturing facilities, creating workforce to do that, right? And then potentially even subsidizing that to make it palatable for the U.S. economy, the U.S. consumers to purchase that thing. That's where it breaks down. Is the government is collecting all the money, but they're not putting out anything that can deliver on your theory of the positives of U.S.-based manufacturing.
Understood.
The other thing I would just say, and this is my personal thing, it's not trademarked yet, maybe Joe Blackman will trademark it, is I'm a big supporter of what I call neo-manufacturing, meaning let's focus on the manufacturing that U.S. populations actually want to do as jobs, and that we can be more successful and more cost-effective than other countries. For example,
keep going. Yeah.
For example, potentially automobiles.
Okay.
Right. Detroit, start. We know what to do.
Yeah.
Potentially software.
Yeah.
AI, let's say. Potentially computer development, chip development, technology-focused things.
Yeah.
Maybe to some level of manufacturing. But, and other countries would then want to buy that from us, right? Now we have a global trade.
Yeah.
But back to tariff, to do tariffs across everything, and the reason why I say neo-manufacturing is newer aged manufacturing type of elements that more align with the United States workforce. Why are we going after Brazil, for example, with whatever it is, 30% to 50% tariff, when they are the largest producers and deliverers of coffee to the United States? We cannot grow coffee beans in the United States.
Not like they can. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, maybe in a lab or in a biodome or something, but we don't have the climate, right?
Yeah.
We can't produce the level of coffee needed for Starbucks to take care of business.
Not in Arizona,
no. So that's the situation where it really breaks down fast is that theory you brought up about manufacturing.
Yeah.
You know, for bananas and mangoes and coffee and things we just can't do in the US. What's the point there? Right. And so that's the challenge and the breakdown of that. So anyway, good discussion.
Okay. Budgeting, long-term planning. You're sitting in the driver's seat right now. You know, tariffs will start to wreak havoc sooner than later. What should one do, public works director, supervisor, utility manager, to get ahead of it? Are you going out and asking for another 30% increase in your annual budget just to be safe, or are you waiting for those tariffs to hit our shores and then asking for the money then?
Yeah, there's a lot in that one. Let's just look at some mitigation real quick, and then maybe we can go a little bit back and forth. Okay, so just jumping into what local agencies could do to mitigate. Here are some just things you can think about this, and I encourage local agencies to strategize with what your region, how it's impacted, things like that. Middle of the country versus coast is going to be different. You're closer to the port, all that stuff. So one of the things you can think about is putting in what we call this economic price adjustment clause into your contracts. which basically allows a contract to be adjusted when it hits a certain percentage for something that is linked to tariffs, for example, which the public agency didn't control and the contractor or the supplier didn't control. And you can have an open book that says, this is the direct impact. Like, it doesn't matter how good of a contractor I am. I can't deal with that thing. And then the local government can have that clause or say, okay, we're going to adjust it by exactly that amount. Okay, that's one thing you can do. The second is escalation indices or allowances. These are things you can put in for specific elements of a project, those most affected by tariffs. We're talking about steel and aluminum today. The other here is owner furnished equipment or long lead item purchases. That's like the stockpiling type of thing, or locally produced or collected, or maybe a government rate you could get for something that your contractor couldn't. And then phasing in early procurement packages. That is about trying to get as much information you can with earlier phases of a project to then potentially order that stuff earlier. The steel beams, if it's a roadway or traffic signal poles, all that stuff that's metal related. And again, we're just talking about aluminum and steel today. Copper's another big one, things like that. And then the last thing I have here, which is kind of how I help agencies, is thinking about using alternate project delivery methods like progressive design build and things like that, so that you can get that information and build it into guaranteed maximum price contracts, use allowances, use contingencies, things like that more strategically, early work packages, in order to try to bring predictability to some of these unpredictable elements.
Sure. Progressive design build. I've heard that term a couple times. It was explained to me. I'm still trying to wrap my brain around it. Can you dive deeper into that, of what it is, and then also how I think it's big. It's starting in California, or sure, of course, it starts on the coast, but where it's starting to be implemented, and what I guess a community, whether you're in the middle of America or on the coast, can use it to further their production.
Yeah, it's a really helpful tool and a powerful tool for agencies to use. And it's an alternative delivery method, Joe, because it's an alternative to just low bidding something. So traditional, you go through a full design, then you put it on the street, and that contractor cannot work with the designer at all. It's illegal. Goes out on the street, and then everybody bids on it, guesses what the prices are, guesses what the intent of the design was. You end up with a project that usually has change orders or unknowns or claims, legal actions. And it's not a quality-based selection of your contractor. It's simply a price-based, lowest price wins. In design build in Arizona, it's called design build, and in California, it's progressive design build, because they started off and they did it wrong actually in California, and we corrected it now. But the design build process is you get a team together of a designer and a contractor, and the difference is you're selecting that team based on qualifications, not price. Generally, that's the progressive part of it. When we say progressive, we're saying you don't need to include price. And then you're selecting that team based on qualifications. And then that contractor is working with the designer. Remember, in the early example, the contractor is legally prohibited from working with the designer. In design build, they're required to work with the designer. And the key is the contractor is informing the designer how they're actually going to build it, and the designer is working with the contractor that's actually going to deliver the job. Versus in the low bid, you have no idea who's going to deliver the job. And then they work together to create and minimize risk and answer questions and all that, to create what's called a guaranteed maximum price package out of that. And they guarantee that price, scope, schedule, budget. But what you can do is you can design things or get more information and do early guarantee maximum price packages or early work packages for something like your steel order, right? Or your copper order. So that's why it plays in here, is if you're strategic about these things and identifying what is most impacted by tariffs, you can work around that a little bit. Within a low bid, you cannot. You finish your design, you can't order anything early usually. Goes out to construction. If the construction project takes 2 years and tariffs hit in the middle of it, you're stuck, right? So
Yeah,
that's that's a whole session on progressive design build. Here are some other things to think about. Pre-qualifying multiple domestic suppliers to have an offset from offshore suppliers, steel, electrical, things like that. Electricals hit really hard with lead times and pricing. That's only if you have a domestic option, right? So that can be a challenge. Next, alternatives are approved equals. That says, well, I specified as an agency this type of air conditioning unit. Well, if that type of air conditioning unit that's designed is only available in India, maybe you can have an approved equal clause that says, I'm going to get one that's from a different country or whatever, and it's going to give you the same output, but it's not going to be the same price. So that's what that is. Staging submittals on compliance checks and time waivers, that's when tariffs are going into place. And then in your schedule, trying to leave some float for adjustment of what happens with tariffs. So
When in your experience, these tactics in these last two slides that you showed, like how many of these are actually being put into use by the 50,000 population public works director? And then I guess, is there a cheat sheet or something besides, of course they can call Shane Silsby for this information, but is there something they can look for that can help them in these, like, again, I think on the other slides you had, pre-purchasing it to make sure you're locked in at a certain rate, because when the tariffs do hit, you won't get that surprise, and now you have to go and get more budget. Again, in my heavy equipment sales, we would order a truck and the truck wouldn't be delivered until 11 months later. And now it's a lot longer than that. Sometimes it's a year and a half until from the time they hit order, they give us a purchase order to the time the truck hits the ground. And it's never a good conversation when you have to go back to the agency and say, hey, we need an extra $15,000 because it's coming downhill from all the different suppliers to build this piece of equipment. So how can your normal public works director get ahead of this to make sure they're doing their due diligence to not have to continue to go back for more budget?
yeah, good question. Is especially with specialty equipment, the lead times are just getting crazy, right? So one of the things you could do is decouple your vehicles, right? Only order the truck, right? Fit it up separately, right? Or only order the equipment fit up. So a lot of agencies want it all to come together, ready to go, pretty much. Well, that takes extra work, extra time, extra equipment, extra pieces. So potentially you can decouple it. There's risk in that because you can have a truck sitting there for 6 months. And so that's one of the things you can do. Your question about our agencies doing this, the two things I'm kind of hearing in the industry is people are trying to give increased lead time in their schedules and trying to adjust their engineers' estimates to try and adapt to some of this. But not a lot of agencies that I'm hearing going to the level of sophistication we're talking about today. Mostly because they've never had to do this before, and now they're just saying, okay, what can be done? And it could be a new process, procedure. They might have an ordinance they have to change. So it's not as easy as just, oh, that's a great bullet point, implement it in this agency. There's strategy around it. That's why I need to work with somebody like me, Joe, to get that done. Okay, so here's other things on your contingency and estimating. Revising quarterly is now important. It used to be you'd do like annual reviews of prices and stuff like that. So that's an issue. And then this is an interesting one just to talk about. I think it's interesting just to talk about globally. And this is not just public works, but this is what's happening to try to mitigate the impact of tariffs. Tariffs are basically increasing the price of everything, right? Depending on where you're at and what it is. So there's three things that businesses overall are trying to do to mitigate it. The first one is called tariff engineering, and that's what's in it. So if you have something that has components, and one of those key components is expensive and it comes from a country that has a higher tariff rate, the issue is, can I get that component from another source, right? Or another material or whatever it is. And if it's a big piece of what that is, then it can reduce your cost because you're shifting the target of that the tariff is hitting, right? So by a component piece. So that's re-engineering it, if you will. The second thing is, it's called product engineering, but it's basically where it's made. So if Brazil has a 50% tariff and fill in the blank country, Canada has a 15% tariff, can you get it made in Canada as a point of origin? And the third one is valuation engineering. The tariff is a percentage, right? We talked about these percentages, which I want to go back to the beginning toward the beginning and go through some of the tariff percentages, but that is built off of the cost of that thing, that good that you're tariffing. Well, in some cases, if you're not talking about raw materials, in some cases, the thing that's being tariffed was actually had a lesser cost when it was originally produced, and it goes through a middleman or a distributor or whatever. So with that, and these are things that businesses are doing to mitigate. With that, I want to go back to this example.
That sounds like adding on a whole nother full-time equivalent to figure out who's tariffed the most and where to buy it from, how to buy it from said country, and then how to get it in to where, you're pretty much hiring a fixer for every port that it goes through to make sure you get it efficiently, and just adding another full-time equivalent to your staff.
Yeah, you're in the way you do some of that is with lawyers and engineering components and sourcers to justify that this cost is this instead of that, right? So let's look at a couple of examples. Hopefully you're okay with some slides here.
Yeah, okay.
So here's what we talk about when we say percentages. Here's what it is. This is as of this last thing. By the way, every country has tariffs. It's got that base tariff or the universal tariff, and then these add on top of that.
What are your thoughts on that? Should every country have a tariff?
Why would you tariff Brazil, for example, for coffee when we have no way to do it in the US, and you're just directly increasing the cost to every coffee drinker in the United States? So the answer is no, right? It should be strategic. It shouldn't be what the president feels that day. It should be what's the reason for this? Yeah.
What should justify a tariff? Like, give us an example.
An example would be where there's something that we could produce at at scale competitively in the U.S. If whatever that thing is, a tariff on the country that would be providing that to us, back to your competition issue, that should be a target for tariffs. Countries that should not have tariffs or should have very low tariffs are where they're producing something either that we can't produce in the US, or they're producing it so efficiently.
Mm-hmm.
Like I had this discussion the other day with somebody, shirts from Vietnam. Okay, the shirt from Vietnam is $50. You tariff Vietnam, all it's going to do is increase the price of shirt. We're not all of a sudden going to have a bunch of textile mills in the United States to produce your shirt, and that shirt would be $300. So why are we trying to create a trade war over a shirt? That's the thing. Like, be a little bit more strategic about it. So these are the tariffs we have today. By the way, every country has them. These are the biggest reciprocal ones. These are the ones that more specifically impact public works, the orange ones I have, right? So we talked about these steel and aluminum, copper, automobiles. You talked about heavy equipment, fleet vehicles, the parts for those. So these are all the things that are happening. And then the example I want to get to is here. Okay, so I tried to do this in one shot. And you start on the left, let's say in China.
Mm-hmm.
I said China is the biggest producer of steel in the world, and they have that 30% tariff you saw on the prior screen. Well, China can do their own reciprocal tariff and add 30%. But let's just say the price of steel is $40 per hundredweight. And remember that graph we looked at early on?
Yeah.
It was about 41 or so. That's where this comes from. I say, okay, it's about 40. So it's a real number. And then you want to order 100 units of that, right? And that's $4,000. $40 times 100, 4,000. Then somehow you need to get that steel or that raw material, whatever, from wherever it's built or not built, but refined.
Email it. Yeah.
Yeah. Can't email the steel.
Yeah.
So you got to get it from, the mountains of China or whatever to the port. And that's usually not the same person, right? It's, you got producers, refiners, and then you've got people that are movers, suppliers, whatever. Well, that's what happens here, right? They're going to charge something to do that, right? But the reason why I have this in here, when I talked about that valuation engineering for tariffs, that third point, that is trying to say my tariff number shouldn't be applied to this number, 4,400. It should be applied to this number because that's the true price of it. Even though it's coming to your port at this price,
Yeah.
I'm going to do an analysis. I'm going to show you. I'm going to go back and look at files and tell you it's only this price. But today, the way it is when you go to export it, China with a reciprocal tariff or whatever, they could add their 30%. So that's how much it is when it leaves China. Now that money, the 30% goes to the Chinese government. That doesn't come. So the other thing that happens in the trade war is the Chinese government gets more money. In this example, then you go across the Pacific Ocean on this freighter, steel freighter. And when you come to the US, this number, right, which is the adjusted number that came from the docks, you're not doubling that up, but now you're applying that 30% to that number. Now you hit it with the 30% targeted tariff we saw from the earlier exhibits, right? China's getting hit with 30% US tariff. And that's why there's a asterisk, is it's going to that number here, not this number here. That would be doubly an issue if the exporters were increasing the price to offset that 30%. That would be a challenge. I don't think that's the way it's happening today. So that's what we charge here. You get US government gets 30% equal to that amount. Then somebody in the US gets it from the port to a manufacturing plant to refine it, or to the construction site, or they warehouse it, and they're going to take a cut, right?
Yep. Yep.
And then at the end of all that, your order for 100 units is this, and your price per unit is this versus this, right?
Yeah.
63 versus 40. But you can see that the difference here, right in the middle, or 30% difference, if all things else were the same, it comes from that tariff from the United States government that's being paid by the people in the United States. So what the reason why I laid this out is kind of show the journey of a piece of steel, but also to say these numbers could be different too, right? Like likely that number, if that's 10% in China, the number over here is probably more like 20% what people are getting.
Yeah.
To handle all that stuff. But I'm just giving you an example.
Sure.
Does this make any sense, or?
No, it does. It shows, I mean, I would think that like when I buy a product, I don't care how much, I guess, of how many hands it passed through, while it was being produced. I just kind of I care about the total price, the end sticker price. But I do understand that if you do add a percentage to the unit number, versus the unit plus the transporter number, that can change significantly versus just, adding a percentage to the unit number. So that pencils out. Yeah.
So that's the challenge, is when you ask me the second question you asked me is like, well, what does it cost? What are the components? Well, it's got a lot of pieces and parts. And by the way, this is steel from China on a certain date. So the variables change depending on the date.
Yeah.
And the country and the
product. The price still goes up and down. Yeah.
Right. And the tariff rate has been going up and down with the current administration. So like we got a tariff truce with China right now. So what does that mean? I only use China because everybody likes to talk about China, and it's the largest producer of steel in the world. The U.S. actually gets, according to my research, most of their steel from Canada. Which is crazy that we're kind of creating a trade war with them. I use the term crazy. I should have said not very strategic, when they are the biggest providers of steel to the U.S. and can probably provide it at a less cost on transport, maybe not a labor cost, but on transport, because you just put on a train. So
yeah.
So that's kind of the one-on-one of how the tariff works when you buy your steel. And let's see if there's anything else interesting.
Federal versus local government responses.
Yeah. So the federal government, they are controlling the tariffs. They're controlling the rate per country. They're controlling what it gets attached to, and they're controlling when they go into effect, and they're collecting the money from all that. So they are really, the federal government is really in control of both ends of it. The law, if you will, or the regulatory action or the rate and the collection of those dollars. At the local level, you don't control any of that, what's happening there. So your control is about those mitigation elements that we went through to try to prepare for that unknown or uncertainty, right? That the way that governments function the most effectively is when there's clarity of mission, there's alignment, there's predictability, and some level of stability. What's happening at the federal level is not providing that stable environment for local governments to then react to more regularly, right, with more predictability. So that's the challenge at the local level. You cannot control that, but there are things you can do to try to be ready and mitigate the impacts of that. In almost every situation, it's going to result in a price increase to you or a schedule adjustment, right? The most strategic agencies will be able to not take those price hits, but in no case are you going to have savings from baseline. It's only going to be, you're not going to pay up from that baseline, right? So
do you think that there will be a certain equilibrium set in the future, meaning tariffs, start to drive prices up? There will be again, still trying to figure out what the win will look like from the tariffs. Let's say there's more jobs. Let's say there's more trade school education to where you can hire a better skilled worker to get your cost of employment or cost of, training down to where your workers are more efficient. You can crank out more widgets a day or week or a month, which help your bottom line. Will we ever see a time where that 30% will settle and then we'll get back to a day or time where the average worker can have a good job and lead a good life with and like one of my things is live in the city that their employees work in. A lot of people that I know in the industry, they can't live in the city that they actually work in. So will we ever get to a moment like that, or is that a pie in the sky euphoria that I'm thinking of?
Ever's a long time. Will we ever get there? What I would say that would push back on getting there or take longer is when you're talking about goods and manufacturing of goods and transport of goods and all those and refinement, that mostly takes your hands, and you have to be there to do that. What is one of the primary factors for employment for the newest generation when it comes to their work or work environment?
TikTok dancing.
Yes, and working remotely.
Oh, yeah.
So how do you work remotely and have a meaningful job at a steel mill, for example?
Yeah.
That's something that pushes against when we say ever. The other thing is if you keep tariffs in place and they're 30%, this is back to the earlier discussion we had about why we're not seeing the full impact yet. As businesses have their profits eaten away by the tariff, and they just take that hit to try to keep the price similar to the consumer. In the background, you talked about this earlier with food and cost of living and all that stuff. Inflation's up, cost of living is up, which further eats away at their profit. So what's going to happen is the profit's going to go to almost zero. Now the full effect of the tariffs are going to be in place because the businesses are not going to have anywhere else to go other than passing that cost on directly to the consumer. And that's where I think there is going to be a reckoning sooner than the utopian world you laid out, which we'd all like to live in, and what's actually going to happen. I think what's actually going to happen is there's going to be tremendous pushback from the business community and ultimately the consumers, because businesses are going to lose profit. So they're either going to have to reduce their quality or lay people off or something. And the consumer is going to pay more and have to receive less quality or whatever. So
I think we've already seen some of that pushback. I mean, Apple, they're building, I forgot what state they're building this huge multi-billion-dollar facility to be able to manufacture not all of the phone in America, but more of it than they would overseas, because that tariff was going to affect them. And I'm sure they went to the current administration, was like, hey, what are you doing? Like, don't do that. Don't do that. And then there's that pushback, who loses? The consumer. So
Yeah. That's interesting. And that's the other thing about the variability. So somebody from Apple goes in and gives a gold statue to somebody, and all of a sudden the tariff doesn't apply to your product, right? It's very difficult
seeing a lot of that. Yeah.
right, for economists to try to figure out what to do with that. The other thing is, these are just words in those discussions, right? So Apple pledges, or Google 300 billion, whatever the number is, whoever the company
That's
is.
true. Yeah.
Is that actually going to happen? Right?
Mhm.
Because in the meantime, the economy is being affected by tariffs, right? We got job numbers and all that stuff. So, and if you don't have a workforce to it, and you can't build the building and all that stuff. So I think it's more of talk right now. So you can get relief from the tariff to try to hope something else will change, and you never have to build that factory, right? So
Yeah.
time will tell.
Gotcha. Anything we're missing in regards to tariffs?
The only thing I missed when I was going through this is kind of the more refined industry components. So we said aluminum and steel, and you and I kind of jumped into what that means, but more specifically, this is what that means, right? And copper's in there too, but grid components or facility components. When I say facility, I mean like vertical structures, like your buildings, your government buildings, or whatever it is. And again, this is for the public works arena. Second, bridges and transit structures. I invite anybody that drives over a bridge to safely look at those bridges and say, how much metal do I see in that bridge? And that tells you the impact of steel prices on having to maintain or rebuild or do a new bridge. Even concrete bridges usually have major steel components for structural integrity. And the last one is water infrastructure, right? Affecting you in Arizona. So, and California. Just putting the pipes in the ground to deal with, drought issues or fire fighting or whatever it is. Now the cost of that goes up because of those steel pipes or aluminum elements. So those are some of the things that are the more specific areas of public works agencies or projects that we expect to see hit.
Sure. Well, in closing, if anybody's listening has any other questions regards to tariffs, feel free to put them in the comments. Also, you can reach out and say, hey, I want you guys to talk more about this or that, or if you have any more pointed questions, we're always looking for more content to do shows on, and I'm sure Shane is up to the task of taking on some of these stickier, hairier topics. And yeah, I'm super curious about all this, so I love learning about it from Shane and from pretty much anybody. So yeah, Shane, any final words before we get out of here?
Thanks for your time as always, Joe. You do a great job. We tried to lay out for public works professionals, what are tariffs, right? What is the impact? How are they applied? And what can you potentially do to mitigate against those forces? I mean, those are kind of the things we tried to hit. I think we did that. And if we did, I think people will be better off by listening to the segment and taking some of those things back to their agencies.
Sure. All right. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in. This has been a special edition of the Public Works Podcast, and we will talk to you guys soon.